Welcome to the channel, and thank you for joining us today. We've got an incredible story lined up, and we can't wait to share it with you. Before we dive in, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story can travel. And if you haven't yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss tomorrow's special story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Grab a seat, relax, and let's get started. This one gesture from a royal guard will melt your heart. It was a crisp morning in London, with a chill in the air that hinted at the possibility of rain, though the sky remained stubbornly overcast. Buckingham Palace stood in the distance, its grand gates surrounded by a crowd of excited tourists, each eager to capture a piece of history with their phones. The atmosphere was buzzing with energy, the constant hum of London traffic in the background, adding to the lively chaos of the moment. Tourists jostled for the perfect photo, maneuvering around each other with the same goal in mind. Get that iconic shot of the royal guards. Children pointed excitedly at the guards, marveling at their stoic presence. The guards, in their traditional red tunics and towering bearskin hats, stood unmoving, a symbol of tradition and discipline. The crowd was restless, a mix of awe and impatience as they sought the perfect moment to capture. Among the crowd stood a mother named Sarah and her 9-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan had autism, and his sensitivity to overstimulation made crowded, noisy places like this particularly difficult. Sarah had been uncertain about whether she should bring him to Buckingham Palace, knowing that the hustle and bustle of the crowd might trigger his anxiety. But as they stood there, watching the royal guards, she noticed something different. Ethan was calm, his gaze fixed entirely on the guard in front of them. He had watched countless videos about the guards before their trip, dreaming of seeing them in person. And now, here he was, standing just a few feet away from one. Ethan's love for order and structure made the sight of the immovable guard particularly captivating for him. The guard's pristine uniform, from the polished black boots to the bright red coat and crisp white belt, was exactly as Ethan had imagined. The guard stood tall and still, unwavering in his discipline, a perfect figure of consistency. Sarah noticed the excitement dancing in Ethan's eyes, the joy and wonder that filled him as he absorbed every detail of the scene before him. Though the crowd swirled around them, Sarah could see that Ethan was focused only on the guard, his attention unbroken by the noise or movement around him. She kept a gentle hand on his shoulder, whispering reassurances when the noise became overwhelming, reminding him to keep a respectful distance from the guard. But even though the crowd pushed closer, even though the noise became louder, Ethan's calm never wavered. He was simply captivated by the stillness of the guard, the sense of peace and order that he represented. Just then, a loud voice cut through the quiet murmur of the crowd. A tall man, clearly irritated, strode past Sarah and Ethan. He was dressed in expensive leather shoes and spoke loudly into a cell phone, barking commands about some business deal. His presence felt like a disruption, an intrusion in an otherwise peaceful moment. He glanced briefly at Sarah and Ethan, his eyes dismissive, before turning his focus on the guard. It was clear that he was irritated by the guard's stillness, the way he stood there motionless, doing nothing to entertain the crowd. As the man's frustration built, Ethan, unaware of the tension around him, took a small step forward. His gaze was still fixed on the guard, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She instinctively reached out to pull him back, but something in her stopped her. Ethan was so focused, so calm, that it seemed almost as if he were drawn forward by an invisible thread. And then, in a moment that took everyone by surprise, Ethan extended his small hand toward the guard's gloved palm. For a brief second, time seemed to freeze. The crowd fell silent, unsure of what would happen next. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, her mind caught between fear and awe. She knew that the guards had strict protocols, and no one ever expected them to break their stoic composure. But what happened next stunned everyone. The royal guard, trained for years to remain perfectly still and emotionless, did something entirely unexpected. He shifted his gaze downward, his eyes meeting Ethan's small hand. The guard blinked, a subtle flicker of warmth in his eyes. Then, in a break from protocol that no one could have predicted, the guard lifted his left hand, gently brushing Ethan's fingertips with his own. It was a simple, fleeting gesture, but in that moment, it was as if time had slowed down. The warmth of his touch seemed to echo through the crowd, and for a few precious seconds, the world seemed to stand still. The crowd erupted in whispers, phones and cameras clicking into action as they recorded the moment that would soon go viral. But in the midst of the excitement, Ethan stood frozen, his eyes wide with wonder. He had just experienced something that few would ever imagine: a royal guard, breaking the rules, offering a moment of connection and kindness to a child who saw the world differently. As the crowd around Buckingham Palace continued to bustle, Sarah couldn't help but keep a watchful eye on Ethan. He was standing still, his hands firmly gripping hers as they remained just a few feet from the royal guard. Despite the constant hum of conversations, the flash of cameras, and the overwhelming noise of London, Ethan remained calm. His focus was entirely on the guard. The moment he had been dreaming of was finally here, and Sarah could see the joy radiating from him as he took in every detail of the scene. Ethan had always been drawn to order, to structure, and the immovable guard in his bright red tunic and tall bearskin hat seemed like a perfect embodiment of that. Sarah had been unsure about bringing him to this crowded, noisy place, but seeing the look of wonder on Ethan's face told her she had made the right choice. His gaze was steady, fixed on the guard's polished black boots, the crisp white belt, and the perfectly still posture. Ethan was absorbed in the quiet discipline of the guard, a figure of control and composure, which felt like a soothing balm amidst the chaos around them. Sarah glanced around, noticing the other tourists shifting nervously in the crowded space, but Ethan seemed entirely unaffected. He wasn't anxious, wasn't trying to retreat from the noise or the bustle. He was simply watching. His excitement was so pure, so intense that it left her heart swelling with pride. Despite his sensitivity to overstimulation, Ethan had found something that allowed him to feel peace. The royal guard, standing motionless, provided the sense of order Ethan craved, and it was almost as if they had found a kindred spirit in each other. Just as Sarah felt a sense of relief, something broke through the peaceful moment. A tall man, dressed sharply in expensive leather shoes and loudly speaking into his cell phone, approached. His voice was cutting through the quiet conversations of other tourists, his words harsh and urgent as he barked orders into his phone about some business deal. He moved with an air of impatience, a man used to getting what he wanted without waiting, his eyes scanning the crowd around him. His presence was disruptive, and Sarah could sense the tension building as he walked past them, barely sparing them. Glance. His eyes shifted toward the royal guard, and for a moment it seemed as though the man's irritation intensified. The guard stood still, doing nothing to engage or entertain him, and that seemed to irk the man. Sarah could feel the shift in the atmosphere as he began muttering under his breath about the guard's motionless posture. He couldn't seem to understand why the guard remained so composed, unbothered by the noise, the crowd, or the impatient people around him. The man's growing frustration was palpable, but Ethan, oblivious to the man's agitation, was still entranced by the guard's unyielding poise. And then, in an unexpected turn, something incredible happened. Ethan, still holding Sarah's hand, took a small step forward. His eyes never left the guard. It was as if something inside him was pulling him closer, a magnetic force that he couldn't resist. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath. As Ethan extended his hand toward the guard, his fingers reaching for the gloved palm, Sarah, heart in her throat, wanted to call out to him, to stop him, but she couldn't bring herself to interrupt this quiet moment of connection. She stood frozen, watching her son take that step into the unknown. The surrounding tourists began to notice, some of them giving curious glances, while others began recording, unsure of what was about to unfold. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. She knew how rigid the rules for royal guards were. No one ever touched them. No one ever spoke to them. It was the foundation of their duty, their centuries-old training. And yet here was Ethan, with all the innocence of a child reaching out to make contact. Time seemed to slow. The crowd hushed, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the world had paused. And then, in a moment that stunned everyone, the royal guard, who had been trained to stand unwavering in his stillness, broke protocol. He turned his head ever so slightly, lowering his gaze to Ethan's outstretched hand. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the guard's eyes soften. In a rare break from his disciplined stoicism, he lifted his left hand, gently brushing Ethan's fingertips with his own. The crowd erupted into whispers, the moment captured on camera and soon to flood social media. But in that instant, as the royal guard broke tradition to acknowledge Ethan's gesture, a profound silence settled over Sarah. This wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a connection that transcended the barriers of protocol, a reminder that kindness can break through even the strictest of rules. Ethan's eyes sparkled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. For Sarah, it was a moment that would stay with her forever, a beautiful testament to the power of empathy and the extraordinary kindness that could still be found in even the most formal of settings. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had grown. Still, the murmur of excitement, the flash of cameras, and the soft hum of London traffic all faded into the background as everyone seemed to hold their breath. Ethan stood frozen, his small hand still extended toward the royal guard's gloved. For a moment, time felt suspended in that one extraordinary instance of connection. The guard, who had been stoic and immovable, had broken protocol, and the simple brush of his hand against Ethan's fingertips had left the crowd in stunned silence. But not everyone in the crowd was content with the unfolding scene. The tall, brash man who had earlier exuded impatience was growing more agitated by the second. His eyes flicked back and forth between the royal guard and the crowd, as if he couldn't fathom why no one else seemed as bothered by the violation of tradition. The guard had broken centuries of discipline for a small child. Wasn't this supposed to be a place of order? A place of solemnity? His frustration bubbled over, and he finally stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Excuse me, do you mind?" the man barked, his voice sharp and dismissive. "You're holding everyone up with this little show," he added, his tone dripping with disdain. He folded his arms across his chest, glaring at Sarah and Ethan, as though their quiet moment of connection had somehow disrupted his day. The other tourists in the crowd looked uncomfortable, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others murmuring under their breath. But the man didn't seem to care. He was used to making his voice heard, and this moment, this simple act of kindness, was clearly beneath him. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She knew how fragile this moment was for Ethan. She had seen his anxiety flare up before when things became too intense, too overwhelming. But here, standing in front of the guard, something had shifted in him. The calmness, the stillness of the guard had been a beacon, grounding him in a world that often felt too noisy, too chaotic. Ethan's hand remained outstretched, and for a moment, Sarah could see the slight tremor in his fingers. But instead of retreating, Ethan's gaze was locked on the guard, as if he didn't notice the tension growing around him. The man's frustration continued to build. He looked at Sarah with an expression that bordered on scorn. "These guards are supposed to stand watch, not entertain," he snapped, his eyes flicking back to the guard's still posture. He shook his head, scoffing as if the scene before him was absurd. But to Sarah, it felt like a moment that defied all the harshness of the world. A rare, tender moment of empathy from someone bound by tradition, a small act of kindness in a place where people were expected to be nothing more than statues. And yet, even as the man's sharp words cut through the air, it was clear that his anger wasn't shared by everyone in the crowd. Some onlookers, who had been watching with fascination, now shifted their focus from the guard to the brash man, their disapproval palpable. A few mothers, noticing the tension, pulled their children closer, offering quiet words of reassurance. One older woman, standing nearby, turned to the man with a gentle nudge, her voice low but firm. "Sometimes a moment like this changes everything," she said almost wistfully. "Just like subscribing to a channel can unlock unexpected delights." The man, clearly taken aback by the woman's comment, hesitated for a moment. He glanced around, clearly realizing that the crowd was not on his side. The tension that had built around him seemed to dissipate slightly, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside him. He muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, but the words lost their sting in the air, drowned out by the murmurs of the people around him. It was as if the man was beginning to understand, albeit reluctantly, that he had lost the battle for control. Meanwhile, Ethan's focus never wavered. He was still looking up at the guard, his small hand lingering in the air, unsure of whether he was allowed to continue. It was then that something subtle but powerful shifted. The guard, who had remained steadfast and silent, seemed to recognize the struggle within Ethan. The stiff posture that had once been a symbol of unwavering discipline now felt like a shield, one that softened just enough to allow Ethan's quiet courage to shine through. Sarah, with a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder, whispered softly, "It's okay, honey. The guard's not upset. You did nothing wrong." Her voice trembled slightly, the weight of the moment sinking in. The guard, still silent, glanced down at Ethan one more time, and in that fleeting moment, he raised his left hand ever so slightly, palm open, in a gesture that spoke volumes. It was a silent permission, an acknowledgement that this moment was as much about connection as it was about tradition. As the guard made this rare gesture, a few onlookers couldn't help but let out a small relieved laugh. The tension that had filled the air was suddenly replaced with something else: compassion, understanding, and an unspoken bond that had bridged the gap between formality and empathy. The man who had been so upset now stood awkwardly on the sidelines, his earlier complaints fading into the background. And Ethan, who had started this journey with so many questions and so much uncertainty, was finally able to smile, his heart filled with wonder. As the brash man's frustration continued to rise, the tension around Buckingham Palace seemed to grow thicker, heavier with each passing second. The quiet moment between Ethan and the royal guard had felt like a fragile bubble, and now, with the man's loud voice cutting through the stillness, it seemed as though everything was about to pop. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some trying to avoid eye contact with the man, while others glanced nervously at the royal guard, wondering how he would react. Ethan, still holding his hand outstretched toward the guard, seemed unaffected by the commotion. His wide eyes were fixed on the guard's tall, immovable figure, his small fingers lingering in the air, waiting for some sign that he was allowed to continue. Sarah felt a wave of anxiety flood over her. She knew how sensitive Ethan could be in moments like this, how one sharp word or an unwelcome gesture could send him spiraling into distress. But as she looked at him, she saw something different. There was no panic. In his expression, no fear. He was simply deeply captivated by the moment. For him, this was a chance to connect with something he had always admired from afar, something that represented stability and order in a world that often felt overwhelming. And yet, the man's harsh words rang louder. "You're holding everyone. Up with this little show," he snapped, his voice biting through the silence. He stood with his arms crossed, glaring at the guard, then at Sarah and Ethan. His posture was confrontational, his irritation clear as day. The people around him looked uneasy, but the man seemed completely undeterred by their disapproving glances. He continued, his voice cutting into the fragile calm. "These guards are supposed to stand watch, not entertain." His words carried a tone of superiority, as though he felt entitled to dictate how others should behave, even in the presence of such an intimate, vulnerable moment. Sarah's heart tightened as she saw Ethan flinch, just slightly, at the sharpness in the man's voice. It wasn't loud enough to completely break his focus, but it was enough to make her pulse quicken with worry. She instinctively moved closer to Ethan, wanting to shield him from the negativity that was quickly swirling around them. The last thing she wanted was for him to retreat into himself, to feel the weight of the harshness that was being directed at them. But Ethan didn't retreat. Instead, he looked up at her, his eyes full of confusion, and for a brief second, Sarah was struck by how much he had grown in this moment. He had been so fascinated by the guard, so absorbed in the silent connection between them, that the world around him, the noise, the frustration, the criticism, didn't seem to matter. She could see that he wasn't processing the man's words the way she expected. Instead, he was just confused, and then something happened. The guard, who had been standing motionless, unfazed by the growing tension, shifted ever so slightly. The subtle movement didn't go unnoticed by the crowd, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The guard, despite the man's aggressive posture and sharp words, angled his body just slightly to shield Ethan from the man's negativity. It was a simple gesture, barely noticeable to anyone not paying close attention. But to Sarah, it was everything. In that moment, the guard wasn't just a figure of authority. He wasn't just a soldier standing in front of the palace, following centuries-old rules. No. In that split second, he became something more, a protector, a quiet defender of a child's innocence. The tension that had been building around them seemed to dissipate, if only for a moment, as the guard subtly positioned himself between Ethan and the brash man, making a silent statement. This was not the moment for hostility. The crowd seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, though no one dared to speak. The man, now realizing that his frustrations were not shared by the crowd, grew visibly uncomfortable. His arms, which had been crossed defiantly, dropped to his sides, and he glanced around at the other tourists, their gazes now fixed on him. The once loud and insistent tone he had carried began to falter, replaced by a hesitant, almost defeated silence. His eyes shifted between Ethan and the guard, and for a moment, it was as if he understood that this wasn't a situation he could control. Ethan, still standing close to his mother, glanced up at the guard, then at Sarah. His face was peaceful, as though the entire world had melted away, leaving only the quiet understanding between him and the guard. And then, in a gesture that would become iconic, the guard gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was as if to say, "I see you." A silent recognition of the child's curiosity, a moment of compassion that transcended the rules, the barriers, the expectations. And in that brief, powerful exchange, Ethan's heart swelled. This wasn't just a fleeting encounter. This was a moment that would stay with him forever. As the man stood in uncomfortable silence, Sarah bent down to Ethan's level. She could see the wonder in his eyes, the gratitude in his expression. "It's okay, honey," she whispered softly. "The guard's not upset. You did nothing wrong." And for Ethan, that was all he needed to hear. The tension that had momentarily gripped the crowd began to fade. As the moment lingered in the air, an unspoken understanding passed between the guard and the child, a simple act of kindness that would forever be remembered by those who witnessed. As the guard's subtle gesture of kindness echoed through the crowd, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, but it didn't last long. The brash man, still standing at the edge of the scene, was clearly uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot, his impatience bubbling up again. He glanced around, his eyes narrowing at the growing number of tourists who had gathered to witness the exchange. A few people had pulled out their phones, capturing the moment for social media, and the excitement in the crowd was palpable. But the man was no longer the center of attention, and that seemed to irk him even more. He took a few steps forward, his face twisted in annoyance. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the moment with a sharp edge. "You're holding everyone up with this little show. We all have places to be." His words hung in the air, sharp and disruptive. The crowd seemed to tense up again, but this time the reaction was different. Some of the tourists glared at the man, shaking their heads, while others stepped away from him as though his negative energy was contagious. It was as if they were silently choosing sides. On one hand, the raw, unbridled frustration of a man who felt entitled to everything, and on the other, the quiet, profound kindness of the guard who had gone against centuries of tradition for a small, curious child. Sarah could feel the tension rising again, her heart racing in her chest. She knew how quickly Ethan could pick up on negativity. His calm demeanor had been a gift, something she hadn't expected to see in such a chaotic environment. But now, as the brash man's harsh words hung in the air, Sarah saw a flicker of confusion in Ethan's eyes. His hand, still lingering, where the guard had brushed his fingers, hesitated for a moment. The moment of wonder seemed to falter as the sharpness of the man's voice cut through Ethan's peace. Ethan, ever sensitive to the world around him, flinched slightly at the man's words. His expression shifted and Sarah's heart sank. She knew how easily Ethan could be overwhelmed by the kind of aggression that the man was projecting. She wanted to step forward, to shield him from the negativity, but the moment was already slipping away. The guard, however, was still there, standing tall, his gaze unwavering. And that's when something extraordinary happened. The royal guard, who had been stoic and still throughout the commotion, shifted his posture just enough to shield Ethan from the brash man's increasing ire. It wasn't an aggressive movement, but rather a protective one, a subtle repositioning of his body that placed himself between the man and the child. The guard didn't need to speak. His stance alone communicated everything that needed to be said. He wasn't just a figure of authority anymore. In that moment, he became something more, a quiet protector, standing between innocence and the harshness of the world. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew quieter. The brash man, still furious but now feeling the weight of the guard's unspoken response, looked around at the other tourists. He could see the disapproval in their eyes, the reluctance to support him. His frustration flared for a moment, and he scoffed, muttering under his breath. "It's ridiculous," he muttered, glancing at his watch. "We all have places to be, and this is a waste of time." But the crowd was no longer on his side. The murmurs of approval began to rise from the group around him. People shifted in place, stepping away from him, while others subtly began to move closer to Sarah and Ethan. One by one, they turned their attention back to the guard and the child, recognizing that this moment, this simple act of empathy, was more important than anything the man had to say. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her as Ethan stood tall, a small but bright smile forming on his face. He looked up at her, his eyes still wide with wonder, but now there was something more. Something stronger. It wasn't just fascination anymore. It was a sense of connection, a sense that despite everything, the world was still capable of kindness. And then, as if the tension had been broken, the man finally relented. He let out a heavy sigh, glancing at his phone one last time before shoving it back into his pocket. His shoulders slumped, and he took a step back, his irritation finally giving way to a reluctant understanding that this moment, this beautiful, simple moment, was something he couldn't control. The guard, still standing firm, looked down at Ethan one last time. Their eyes met, and the guard gave a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of Ethan's bravery in the face of adversity. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. And for Ethan, it was enough. He had been seen, understood, and in a world that often felt overwhelming, he had been protected. As the guard prepared to step away, replaced by a new one, Ethan reached up, almost instinctively, and gently touched the guard's uniform one last time. Sarah smiled, her heart full as she whispered, "It's okay, sweetie, you did great." In that moment, the chaos of the world outside seemed far away. The crowd had returned to their usual routine, snapping photos and moving forward with their day. But for Ethan and Sarah, this moment would stay with them forever, a reminder of the power of empathy, of protection, and of the unspoken connection between a child and a guard who broke protocol for the sake of kindness. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this touching moment between Ethan and the Royal Guard. What do you think about the guard's unexpected gesture of kindness? Do you believe breaking protocol in such a situation was the right thing to do, or do you think the guard should have followed the rules strictly? It's fascinating how a small act of compassion can impact so many, and we'd love to hear your opinions on how moments like this can change perspectives. Have you ever experienced a moment where kindness broke through the routine or the rules? Maybe it changed your outlook, or maybe it made you see the world a little differently. Share your stories with us in the comments below. We'd love to read them. And don't forget to let us know where you're watching from. It's always Amazing to see how these stories can bring people together from all corners of the world. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more heartwarming moments like this. You won't want to miss what we have in store for tomorrow.